We will probably have additional folks join us, but we're going to push ahead and try to stick to time here. A very warm welcome. My name is Jason Turflinger. I head up the American Chamber of Commerce in Norway. A special welcome also to our friends at or from AmCham Sweden and AmCham Finland. We have, did Alexandra sign on yet? I'm not sure, but I know we have Peter with us. Anyway, I am the Norwegian version of Alexandra and Peter. AmCham's Cross-Industry Digitalization Forum was initiated together with today's moderator, Jennifer Vessels. It was initiated back in 2016, believe it or not, as a collaborative platform for our member company leaders to better understand digital business environment challenges and opportunities. In other words, participants share both what works and what doesn't in their respective digital transformation efforts. Quite ironically, the last time this group met in person in March, and little did we know that things would go the way they have for all of us, challenges all around. We appreciate seeing Gerry here and all of you here. Original plan was in person. Gerry, you were going to be able to make your way to Oslo, but still appreciate you taking the time to be with us virtually. It's maybe perhaps especially fitting that the Digitalization Forum is taking place virtually and still going forward. A couple programming notes, if I may. Again, everyone, if you could please keep your microphones and cameras off initially for the first half approximately of today's session. And then during the Q&A, we can go to cameras and live mics for those with questions. During Gerry's presentation, feel free to ask questions via the chat function and or put your digital hand up. I should also note that the first half of this session will be recorded, so Gerry's presentation will be recorded. We will be turning the recording off for the Q&A session afterwards. Now to introduce our special guest, who is a board member of the US-based parent company of AmCham member Task Analytics. Dublin-based Gerry McGovern helps large organizations deliver a better digital customer experience, the focus of today's presentation. In addition to the World Health Organization, Gerry's clients include Microsoft, Dropbox, Cisco, NetApp, VMware, and IBM. He has also consulted with the US, UK, EU, Dutch, Canadian, Norwegian, and Irish governments. Gerry's a highly regarded speaker and has presented in 35 countries and has written 7 books on digital customer experience. Gerry, a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us from Dublin, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you everyone for coming to watch this session. So I've been dealing with a lot of governments recently in relation to COVID-19, and a common phrase that has come back is panic publishing when it comes to actually dealing with the digital space. And if you don't want to panic, you need to plan. And it's a strange thing. I find that there's very little planning or true planning that occurs when it comes to digital, in my experience of dealing with a lot of organizations over the years. So one of the plans, so to speak, or the outputs of one of our plans was this over the last couple of weeks, and I'm going to explain how we got to this actual structure. But I was presenting this to a number of executives a couple of weeks ago, and somebody said, well, now we need, that's interesting, but now we need to do some design. It was as if this is not design. And this has been a challenge that I've faced in my 25-year career, because it seems that particularly for senior executives, when it comes to digital, it's not design if it doesn't have a big hero shot of somebody smiling and it doesn't have some nice colors. That it seems that the only thing that is truly equated with design and digital is something that looks pretty, and that we measure things by how they look rather than how they work. So just to ask this question, is this design? I've been dealing with health and global health for maybe 10 or 15 years in the digital space. And I was involved around the time of the swine flu pandemic. You'll notice on the European pages, they didn't call it swine flu, they called it H1N1, even though nobody was searching for that, of course, but because they didn't want to hurt the feelings of the pig industry. Why would they call it something that actually the vast majority of people were calling it? At least that was the thinking back then. We're going to control the communication. We're going to decide what people actually call it. And of course, everybody is coming to the website looking for a personal message from the commissioner. That is, of course, what should be the number one thing that is presented. And to a degree or not, in many environments, this is still the way organizations behave, thinking that the world is interested in what they think or what they want to say, rather than the world cares about what you're actually doing, not what you're saying about what you're doing. And this was the Health Canada website around the time of the H1N1 virus, a classical design coming, of course, from the thinking of print and brochureware. It is, if you're coming with flu and you're coming with symptoms, that the most essential piece of communication is to show a picture with somebody blowing their nose, because that's really important. That's really something you need to communicate the essence of the message with. And of course, you've got your slider and your carousel where each little section gets their own funny picture to present to people who might be dying with H1N1 virus, because this is the essence of design as far as 80% of organizations in the world are concerned. Today, interestingly, if you go to the health section for Canada, you don't see any of pictures blowing noses or anything like that. You actually find stuff that actually matters to people about the current situation, about getting email updates, about the epidemiological summary. Actually, it's useful, strangely. They've got rid of all this organization-centric thinking. They've stripped away to the essence, and they focus on actually what people want, which strangely makes them much more successful. Instead of telling the world about all the things that they're doing for Canadians, they actually help Canadians. And that's what the great digital experience is. It's the organization getting out of the way and getting its ego out of the way and actually giving people what they actually want. That's when the web is actually working. This was the initial response from the WHO. They said, oh, what are we going to do in dealing with the coronavirus, COVID-19? Let's ring up the Department of Useless Images. Hello, is that the Department of Useless Images? Yes, we need a useless image for coronavirus. How about some people walking across a pedestrian crossing? Oh, that's a brilliant useless image. Let's put that useless image on the page. People are going to be really impressed with our useless image. It's going to be the most useless of all the useless images that has been actually used. Well, when they had that useless image on their homepage, they had a 1% of people clicking on find out more. And when they went to a really boring red box, which isn't really design, I mean, that's not cool at all. Why would you put a red box? How garish, how undesigny that is. Well, it actually went to 21% of clicks on the actual link. So a 2,000% increase in activity by actually not putting a stupid image on your homepage and trying to annoy people. Sometimes focusing on people's actual needs rather than focusing on the needs to try and impress can actually achieve a lot. There's huge evidence for this. I mean, this is the age of evidence, yet most websites are still designed based on opinions. I often say the worst way to design a website is to have 5 smart people in a room drinking lattes, and the longer you leave them in that room, the worse the website becomes. This was the UK government. They were testing a whole bunch of pages and actions, and there was 8 iterations of this specific design. And as you see, one of them had a picture, a nice big picture of friendly people. When they did the analysis, the iteration with the picture was the worst performing of all. Sometimes images get in the way. I'm not saying if you're working for Toyota, of course, you have got to have the images of the car to help sell the car. But in a great many situations, what we understand as design or what is conceptualized as traditional design gets in the way and actually damages the success of the organization. But unfortunately, executives within organizations cannot get rid of their 1970s and 1980s thinkings about what concepts of design are. This is one of the top designers on the web. His name is Daniel Burka. And he said that 90% of my design critiques these days, and this is May 2020, 90% of my design critiques these days are your text is too small to read. Why do designers love tiny type? I mean, this is extraordinary that in 2020 we still have to be doing this. And the reason is that this is readable, but this is design. And you know why people do this? Because most designers, they don't design text to be read, they design it to be looked at. They see it as part of the overall essence. I mean, why else would you choose grey text? Why else would you choose tiny text? You don't want your text to be read. You don't care about the people using the environment. And this is the dominant today, still the dominant design culture about make it look beautiful rather than make it look useful and make it actually be useful. So is this design? We saw earlier it laid out for a larger environment, but this is laid out for an actual phone, for a smartphone. Visitors, before the pandemic, there were about 8 million people visiting the WHO website. Every week now, there are about 31 million people visiting. Most of those, the shift has been towards the public. We did analysis in 2019 before the pandemic, and we found that about 31% coming to the website were individuals and families. And that when the pandemic hit, it jumped to 56%. So a huge increase in visitors from the actual general public. Before the pandemic, about 55% of those people were coming to the website using their mobile phone. After, it was 70%, and in some cases 75%. So there's a massive increase in the public coming to the site using their mobile phone. And typically they're mobile phones like this. It's not the big expensive latest gizmo from Samsung or from Apple. These are what the vast majority of people in the world have. And what sort of experience are they getting when they try and access a website? 12 million of them every week coming from using these type of mobile phones. Most of the times we don't even think about our users in design. It's this strange separated world that digital is, and that it is more about pleasing the opinions of the executive than focusing on the needs of the customer. This is a study done last year by an organization called Backlinko. They analyzed over 5 million desktop and mobile pages. And what they found was that the average size of web pages was 4 megabytes, which is an extraordinary size. 10 or 15 years ago, it was 400 kilobytes. So what's the impact of these grossly obese web pages? Well, one of the impacts is the average experience of a download for mobile for typical ordinary people can be up to 27 seconds. Now, Google recommends that a page should download within 1 second, certainly within 2 or 3 seconds. Page download speed is the most basic test of quality on the web, and 80 to 90% of pages and websites are failing the most basic test of quality. We should be ashamed of ourselves if we're involved in digital, and this is the state of our industry. Because we're all designing for this, the latest gizmo, the coolest thing. We have become so separated in digital from the audience and the needs of the actual audiences we are supposedly trying to serve. This is what we do in design. Let's put a big picture and look at these design concepts that have come in the last 3 or 4 years. How patently stupid do you have to be to create a design like this? Who would hide the search and who would hide the navigation? The two most essential things that make the web are links and search. That's what differentiates it from print. That's what differentiates it from anything else. And yet, in the last 3 or 4 years, clever designers have started hiding search and hiding navigation. Design has gone incredibly backwards in digital in the last 3 or 4 years. This is a site called Matlin, and they had hidden the search. But when they brought the search onto the page, they had a 32% increase in searches on mobile and a 51% increase in searches on tablet. What you hide doesn't get used, or gets used much, much less. So we are going backwards with our design principles today. The hamburger menu is one of the most stupid concepts to ever emerge in my 25 years of working in digital. So here was this organization with its stupid hamburger menu, when they even just called it a menu, because most people don't even know it's the menu. But all us cool people assume that everybody knows it is. They had a 13% increase in clicks and activity. When they actually brought the core links onto the page about what they're supposed to be about, the story, the products, the buy, the more, they had a 100% increase in clicks. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies showing that hamburger menus and hiding search are a monumentally stupid thing to do, and yet we keep doing them because we're cool and because we're lemmings and we follow what everybody else is doing. This here in Google Translate, icons are also another really stupid form of navigation. When they actually call the things and give them names, they had a 25%. That's a significant increase in Google Translate by actually using words and having a good classification and a good structure in your environment. Here, a NASA app, they had hidden the menu. They made the menu visible, the essential elements. What happened? 600% increase in usage within the environment the day after they made the menu visible. Here's another one that went in reverse. They had some menu items here before they got rid of it and did a hamburger type design, and a massive drop in behavior. What you hide becomes invisible. What you make visible becomes used. You make visible that which needs to be used the most. It doesn't require rocket science to actually figure this stuff out, but unfortunately, so many organizations don't seem to be able to. Icons, are essentially irrelevant. They may please the ego, but they rarely have any functional use. This was the Health Canada's pages in March. And this is their pages now, stripped down, focused, to the point. If this is how we design in an emergency, why do we need to say, well, now we can be stupid, it's not an emergency anymore, let's do silly, stupid stuff again that boosts our egos or make ourselves feel happy internally. Predictability of unlabeled icons. I showed you about icons earlier, and they look cool, but they're generally useless. If you label them, there was an 88% success rate. It is the word, W-O-R-D, is still by far the most important design component in digital, right? Unlabeled icons had only a 60% success rate. Unique icons had only a 34%. So almost 70% of people failing to find what they needed. What's the purpose of an icon? It's supposed to help people find stuff that they're looking for, and they signally fail because it is still words that drive behavior in digital and on the web. Even if you're looking for images, you can't find images if there isn't good metadata for those images. This is the NHS, the UK NHS. We see 10 years ago, they were still stuck in print, but the best organizations today, they've focused. From a design point of view, it seems like they've gone backwards, but no, they haven't, because when you need to use the environment, it's a totally different. Check if you have coronavirus symptoms. This is what people need: good, well-written links and good, well-written contents. The same with the Irish environment. The symptoms, check symptoms. These links will change as the nature of the pandemic changes and what's going to be prioritized. This is Canada, financial assistance in the process. This is design. Yet this is the design that 80% of organizations that I deal with avoid and don't want to deal with because they think it's boring, etc. in the process. So what I've done over the last 15 or 20 years is develop what's called the Top Task Information Design Framework. And the essential part of it is that you must identify what matters most to people and what matters least. So identify the top tasks and the tiny tasks. It is the tiny tasks that kill the design, because the tiny tasks, when they go to sleep at night, they dream of being a top task. You need to identify your top tasks and design around those tasks. Is it symptoms? Is it financial support? You need to understand the most essential things to your customer and design around those most essential things. So then you measure, are they able to do that? Are they able to find out about financial support? Were they able to check the symptoms? You must measure the outcome, not the fact that you have launched the initiative. Everyone says, oh, chatbots are a disaster. Chatbots are a total disaster for 9 out of 10 organizations. Yet I hear more and more senior executives saying, we need a chatbot. Why? You know, because it's cool, because everyone else has it, not because it actually works. We need to measure what works. We need to grow up. We're still in a kind of an infantile stage when it comes to digital and how we think about digital and how we measure digital. We measure success based on the success of people completing their top tasks, and we seek to continuously improve the performance of those top tasks. It is a relentless focus on what matters most and a continuous improvement on what matters most. This has been used by many organizations over the years. Toyota have restructured their whole features and specifications information and their overall architecture based on top task studies. We found 3 major sections in buying a car: features and specifications, prices and costs, reliability and warranties. That seems like something trivial that you do in an afternoon. Well, that took 6 to 12 months of work with thousands and thousands and thousands of people constantly testing it to get it right, because the essence of great design is constant testing and designing with your customers. The core part of top tasks is to define the environment. This is what we did with COVID-19. We went out and we said, well, what is the environment? They've defined the genome. How do we define the information genome? Because you can't solve the problem if you don't know what the environment is. You can't identify top tasks if you don't know what all the possible tasks are. So we went through a huge process to figure out all the things that could matter in relation to the pandemic, to COVID-19. That was a big, complicated process to define this environment. And then we looked at web pages, we looked at discussions on communities, we looked at research, we looked at Google, we looked at way beyond digital. It wasn't just digital, it was about trying to understand what are all the things that matter, whether they be in digital or in physical in this specific space. And I believe that is the most fundamental thing that you need to do if you want to do digital right. If you don't want to panic, you need to plan, and the foundation of any plan in digital is developing the overall environment and understanding the core information architecture. So when we went out and we asked people to vote on this, they quite clearly told us what mattered. The number one thing they said was vaccine. This was both doctors and the public and academics, etc. Latest news, transmission spread, epidemiology, immunity, antibody testing. This gave us a clear sense of what really mattered. This is the 9 tasks got the first 25% of the vote. In most environments that we do this in, and we've done it in about 500 or 600, typically the top tasks are somewhere between 3 and 5. So the fact that it's 9 tells us a type of a story from a design point of view. This is what we call a super task environment. So you see here the blue line is this particular study, and there's a task that has really jumped out. It's way ahead of everything else. The red line is the average of the 500 or 600 studies that we have done over the last 15 or 20 years. So when you get a super task, this is telling you that you need this sort of design. A super task is like a book a flight. It shouldn't even be behind a link. It should be immediately doable when the person comes to the actual page. That's a reasonably rare environment to find a super task, but that's the type of design approach you need when you have a super task. When you have the opposite of a super task, so the black dotted line is the average of the 500 or 600 over the last 15 or 20 years, and the blue line is the response that we got from WHO. So this tells us we have the opposite of a super task. And when you have the opposite of a super task, this is the type of design that you actually need. There are multiple tasks that have relatively equal importance. So you need to present them all with relatively equal importance. This, the European Commission used the top task approach to restructure all their content across their 27 country websites. What we find as well is a commonality of top tasks. We looked, when we did the WHO study, we found that basically they wanted the same thing across all the different roles and responsibilities and continents. And what that tells us is that we can create a structure around vaccine and news and transmission that will meet the needs of everybody around the world. And we often find this, that there are top tasks that dominate across segments and genders and ages, etc. And if you can discover those top tasks, you can create an overall architecture based on them. Audience-based navigation is one of the weakest forms of navigation on the web. I don't have time to explain why. If anyone wants to ask me a question about that later, I'll explain it. You are much better, much more stable if you take a task-based structure in your information design for digital than an audience-based structure. So we had identified our top tasks. We went back out because the key in digital design is designing with people, not for people. So we went back out to our audience again and we said, here's the top tasks. How would you organize them? How would you group and cluster them? So we got people to basically group the tasks, and 840 people did it. It was an extraordinary response. Typically, we only need about 40 or 50. And we can see here, you know, WHO guidelines and WHO position are strongly grouped together, etc. So you begin to see patterns, because the patterns are always out there. And the good designers, they don't create patterns, they discover patterns of human behavior. Humans think in common. We see, we asked the healthcare providers to sort the tasks, and you see that diagnosis is being grouped with symptoms, an incubation period. We asked individuals and families to group the tasks. You'll see that diagnosis is being grouped with symptoms. 72% of people group diagnosis with symptoms, also incubation period. So healthcare providers were grouping medical information the same way individuals and families were. That's strange. So were academics. Diagnosis grouped with symptoms. Often there are common human mental models that run across roles and actual responsibilities. Humans have far more in common than we think we have, and we behave with far more common patterns than it is assumed we behave in. And if we can understand those common patterns, we can create very powerful designs. So we got a hypothesis out of all that sorting, and we showed that to people because we wanted to test it, because you can't just go straight from that sorting into an architectural design. So we went back out to people and we asked them questions such as, can you get infected by COVID-19 through the air, to see how was the architecture actually working. And we went through several rounds of this sort of testing, and we were able to discover things like, when we tested the task around at-risk vulnerable, which groups are most vulnerable to COVID-19, we found that even though we had a certain success to 2 categories, it still had only a 48% success rate, and we had lots of problems with that particular task. So we're beginning to see, well, what's working in the architecture and what's not working in the architecture. Again, it's a model of testing and evidence, of designing with people, not for people. So finally, we evolved the architecture and we got to this particular structure, and we still kept testing, find advice on maintaining healthy family relationships. This is how you measure things. You observe real behavior of real tasks, and you make decisions based on what is occurring in that behavior. So in round 1, we had a 60% success rate. In round 2, we had an 80% success rate. 80% in a complicated environment is an extraordinarily high success rate. I can explain why later if there's a question on that. So we got evidence from 140 countries. We had 6 country health agencies. The Norwegian health agency was actively engaged in the whole process as well, as was the New Zealand, the Irish, the UK, the Canadian and others. We had hundreds of UX experts involved. We had 20,000 people voting on the task, and we had over 800 people sorting and over 3,000 people testing the process. And this is what we got in the end. And people say, is that it? Is that all you achieved after all that work? You know, is this design? Yes, this is design. This is the core of all great digital design. And yet it is signally ignored by 80 to 90% of the organizations. They don't want to do this hard and difficult work to really build the proper foundations for a successful digital enterprise. So that's my talk, open to any sort of questions or feedback. Thank you. Thank you for listening.